we can understand why we would think like that, since sometimes we would observe these really special phenomena, beautiful things we'll observe under the experimental setup, or even the instruments that were used, especially back in the day when there was so much craftsmanship involved in making a microscope or the air pump. So we could think that there are all these features that are contributing, the performative aspect as well of the experiment, that are contributing to the aesthetic value of the experiment. But I said that I don't think those are essential features. What actually matters is that concept of the relationship between the design and the result, how the experiment achieved its purpose, and the elegance behind the setup. And it also kind of really encompasses and embodies the ingenuity of the experiment.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. Hello, everyone. My guest today is Dr. Milena Ivanova. She's bi-fellow at Fitzwilliam College, University of Cambridge. She studied history and philosophy of science at the University of Athens. She also holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Bristol. Milena is co-editor of the Aesthetics of Science, Beauty, Imagination, and Understanding from Routledge in 2020, and also author of Duhem and Holism from Cambridge University Press in 2021. And currently she's co-editing a book on the aesthetic nature of scientific experiments that's forthcoming with Routledge. So, Milena, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for taking the time. It's such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure as well.
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of your work. I think you're doing some really awesome stuff. Tell me about what drew you to this topic of beauty in science as a philosopher.
Wow, it's just really hard to pick one particular moment in history of my academic development, but I think the love for the relationship between science and art goes really back before I even knew that there was philosophy and history of science. Discipline existed. I think it goes back to being young student at school and finding out things about art that I did not know, and the relationship between art and science that I had no idea about. I used to think science is one completely different thing from art, and finding out, I remember, for instance, studying sculpture, and I was really fascinated by ancient Greek sculpture, and just finding out how much knowledge was involved in creating motion in this ancient Greek statues, from going from very rigid form to being able to depict kind of very beautiful proportions of the human body and movement, really complex movement. How this starts in, 600 BC, when you have this very rigid depictions of the body, to then kind of improvement in anatomy and physics, understanding gravity, how that impacted the ability for then the Greek sculptors to portray motion. That was really fascinating to me, how this relationship existed, and finding out that artists like Leonardo da Vinci were actually scientists too. So his work was really important in anatomy and valued not just for its beautiful artistic kind of dimension, but also for the development of scientific knowledge. That dimension was very important too. And so understanding that there's this relationship between science and art was, I think, the first spark in wanting to pursue further this connection. And then being, very privileged to study history and philosophy of science, and understanding values behind the production of knowledge in science, and context, and what values people had at different periods, and how artistic developments often went hand in hand with scientific developments. This all was really there to push me to think about this subject. But I have to say I shied away from it when I was doing my research. So when I was a PhD student, I was thinking about a very different thing. I was thinking about the development of special and general relativity and the development of non-Euclidean geometry. So I had a very specific time frame in science. And that's what I did my PhD on, the philosophical questions that arise in that particular period of time and the development of physics. But it was by studying this period, I could not notice that most of the scientists I was studying constantly talked about beauty. And that was the final push for me to start thinking about the beauty in science more seriously. So when I finished my PhD, I felt a little bit more free to be creatively kind of constructive with what questions I'm going to be answering next. And I felt like the pieces were there to start asking some really interesting questions about beauty in science and what role it plays. And that's how I got to the research that I'm doing today.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. So thanks. The concept of beauty, though, I mean, that's something that I'm curious about what you think of it. I mean, when you were studying, I guess, before you even started your philosophical studies, well, what did you think of the concept of beauty? And was that something that interested you as a concept, or is it mainly from the kinds of narratives of scientists that you found yourself interested in this idea?
I was definitely interested in the concept of beauty way before I went to university. And that's probably because I grew up during the communist regime in Bulgaria. And I was really interested in architecture. And the immediately visual kind of buildings around me were not very beautiful at all. There were these concrete structures that were built to, house a lot of people. They were built with a particular design and function in mind, but they were really not very visually pleasing. Whereas on the other hand, our historic buildings are incredibly beautiful. And so I developed interest in architecture and just constantly pondered to this question, like, why don't we build more beautiful buildings around here? Why is our neighborhood looking so gray and not very appealing, not visually pleasing at all? But then you go into other places and you feel like the works, the buildings are works of art and you really admire them and you have special experiences when you appreciate them. And so definitely it was in my mind, but it never occurred to me that science can be beautiful until I went to university.
Wow, great, great. So tell me, I mean, the concept of beauty has been criticized by many. It's been considered in some fields of the arts as outmoded. And, the preference seems to be to talk about aesthetics more broadly. What makes beauty relevant to scientists as a concept? And is it helpful for understanding the practice of science?
I think it's definitely helpful, and I think it's really important that we understand what role it plays in scientific activities. We can understand why in art we have this move away from beauty because art has developed in many different ways, and we have revolutionary art that challenges many concepts. One of them is what art is, and we have presentation of very ordinary, displeasing objects in a artistic setting, and then we get to wonder, is this really artwork? What makes it artwork? Was the positioning of an ordinary object like Duchamp's urinal, does positioning it in the museum or the art gallery what makes it an artwork? What is it exactly about it? Because it's not the intrinsic features. There's nothing very beautiful about the artifact itself. So we can see how traditionally we get to interrogate these concepts in philosophy of art and in history of art. We have very much the evolution of understanding what art is, what it's meant to do, and we get to see some artistic kind of works as experiments and actually asking these questions, right? We get to really consider how our reactions are, what intuitions are about what makes something an artwork when we're presented with these kind of experimental works, right? In science, it's really interesting that scientists continuously talk about beauty, no matter what the setting, no matter how science is changing. We see that it's a notion that continues to be used and that it plays interesting functions in reasoning, right? So we think that one interaction with beauty that we have when you start even inquiring something is just appreciating nature, and that can be triggering into investigation because we find nature beautiful. Many phenomena are incredibly beautiful, and that can spark fascination to find more about, the function behind a particular phenomenon that we encounter. But we see that scientists use this concept also when they describe how they select hypotheses or design experiments or reconstruct images or present simulations or write code. And that idea that they're using these kind of aesthetic judgments and particularly think about beauty in those contexts is really interesting. And different scientists in different fields continuously talk about these features throughout different traditions as well. And what's really interesting is, what is it doing there? Is it simply aiding selection when there's no other options, no other kind of criteria, perhaps, the considerations to help us make choices? Like if you have two explanations that fit with the phenomena and one is more beautiful, well, why not choose that, right? You can think that it's a purely heuristic kind of tool for us to use beauty. But there's so many scientists that say something much more substantial than this, that they think there's a special relationship between beauty and truth, and they think that beauty can be actually the factor that makes you trust a particular hypothesis or theory. And we find that this persists. And we have this idea going back from the ancient philosophers like Plato to people like Paul Dirac and Albert Einstein, to more recently scientists like Marie Gell-Mann, for instance, expressing these ideas. And so it's really fascinating that the scientists do make these kinds of judgments about beauty. They use it in different ways. And from the perspective of a philosopher, what I want to understand is that a good idea? First of all, how are these judgments made, in what context? And then, is that a good idea? What exactly can we say beauty justifiably can do in scientific theorizing? That's the big question, or the big questions behind this kind of reasoning. But the more, I think, interesting question at the moment I'm thinking about is actually just understanding how these judgments enter in designing experiments and evaluating data, more kind of practice related questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. So, yeah, because I mean, there's certainly, I would imagine, the experience of encountering the beauty of nature or of natural objects or the phenomena that scientists study might be fairly consistent across history, but then the kinds of particular heuristic uses of beauty, certain equations as guides to truth. I mean, is that mode of, say, seeing beauty in the sort of in scientific objects or in the process of doing science, do you see that as being a consistent feature of science, or is there something new to, is this basically, is the concept of beauty changed in some way in these dimensions of science?
I mean, my initial kind of approach was that, well, why should we expect that there is anything consistent among different scientists in different scientific periods, right? Science changes really dramatically in different kind of centuries, how it's done, thinking about experimental practice. Also, we see dramatic changes if we think about tabletop experiments in the 17th century, simple, very cheap stuff. Equipment is cheap, one person performs. And we think about today when thousands of people were involved in the construction of massive experimental setups. And, there's such different ways of making an experiment, for instance, or the scientific theories as well, very different. Why should we expect there is anything stable? But I think there are ways to address this question and think that there is something stable actually. And that's certain ways to understand beauty as a notion that captures a relationship of functionality, basically how well something suits its purpose. And that can be achieved by different ways, but there's something stable in appreciating optimality for purpose. And I think that kind of focus can help us escape this idea that, well, if people have such a different, disagreeing conceptions of beauty, how can they possibly even say these judgments have any objectivity to them? And how could we think that scientists can agree among themselves when they talk about beauty? I think we think about that way, about functionality, appreciating functionality and optimality for purpose. We can think that, yeah, we can accommodate a lot of different ways of doing science and doing experiments and still appreciate this kind of intricate beauty behind that setup.
Could you give us an example of what that might look like, that appreciation for functionality and optimality across experiments, and what role beauty plays there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so I've argued in my work that when we ask what makes an experiment beautiful, we can think about some very immediate features to experiments that come to our mind. So maybe I should give an example to this. One very nice experiment that's really celebrated for its beauty is Leon Foucault's kind of experiment to demonstrate Earth's rotation. And that was performed in 1851 in the Pantheon in Paris. And it's a very simple experiment, which basically involves taking this brass sphere hanged on a rope and being swung in motion. And there was some sand underneath it. And so people could go into the Pantheon to see that experiment, and they would see this kind of kinetic sculpture around, slowly moving. And, there's something immediately beautiful about it. If you think about it, that experience of observing it is a pleasing experience to have. There are some visually pleasing features to that experiment, but I argue that these features are really not necessary or sufficient to our aesthetic appreciation of the experiment. I've argued that what really matters is how this experiment achieved its goal, what showed and how, right? And the beauty of that experiment lies exactly in this idea that by using these kind of very ordinary objects, very economical setup, the scientists had the ingenuity to create the setup that optimally showed the phenomenon that they wanted to show. So the experiment achieved its purpose. It had like optimality and functionality. And so these kinds of considerations, I think, are what matters and could be translated into a very complex experiment that perhaps will not have these visual features at all, or we will not be able to perceive anything about the results, right? In large scale experiments, it takes a really long time to really have confidence in what exactly results we have obtained. But when we think about the kind of functionality for purpose, we can still talk about beauty in that way and appreciate what really matters. And it's kind of the intellectual beauty, appreciating design for purpose, that seems to be able to carry over despite the difference in the experimental traditions we're thinking about.
Right. So it seems the purpose of the experiment is really critical then for an assessment of what is beautiful about that experiment. Because I've seen Foucault's pendulum in a museum, and it's certainly impressive. My kids would, stand in awe of the shapes that it produces, and it never struck me that there was something actually optimal about the way that was done. And I suppose I would need to better understand the context in which those kinds of goals were being pursued, and what made this particular development innovative in a way that has, I suppose, made it stand the test of time as an exemplary experiment, no?
Absolutely. And in that way, the works that scientists produce are very similar to the works artists produce, right? Because you don't necessarily understand an artwork from your first interaction with it. And not every artwork will give you visually pleasing features, or the aesthetic value of the artwork will not be immediately accessible to us. We'll have to do a little bit of work and think, okay, why did the artist select this particular tone of colors or these particular shapes to express the kind of emotions that they wanted to express? For instance, if we're thinking about painting, usually interacting with the artwork requires a little bit of work. And that's when we consider artists to be successful, when they make us do that work.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. Well, listen, so Milena, you've argued that beauty matters both for the design of experiments and for their significance. Could you unpack that for us? What does that mean?
Well, what I was arguing is to step away from thinking that the beauty of an experiment will be found in the visual features. We can very quickly think like that if we think about some very famous experiments, in particularly in early scientific practices. You know, early experiments in the Royal Society times, 17th, 18th century, had oftentimes were very performative and had very immediately accessible features to them. So we could very quickly arrive at this decision that, well, the beauty of the experiment was just the setup we get to see, right? And we can understand why we would think like that, since sometimes we would observe these really special phenomena, beautiful things we'll observe under the experimental setup, or even the instruments that were used, especially back in the day when there was so much craftsmanship involved in making a microscope or the air pump. So we could think that there are all these features that are contributing, the performative aspect as well of the experiment, that are contributing to the aesthetic value of the experiment. But I said that I don't think those are essential features. What actually matters is that concept of the relationship between the design and the result, how the experiment achieved its purpose, and the elegance behind the setup. And it also kind of really encompasses and embodies the ingenuity of the experimenters. So we have, for instance, the experiment that was designed by Michelson and Woolley to test the relative velocity of the Earth with respect to the ether. Einstein said about this experiment that it was absolutely beautiful because of the way it was designed, and that Michelson deserved the title of the artist in the science. That there's this kind of appreciation for the design and how that design optimally delivers the result. I think that interrelationship between the two is where the aesthetic value really comes from, and that can be illustrated with really insightful experiments that kind of, we might wonder if there's anything visually pleasing about them, but there was an elegant idea, really well optimally designed setup, using the best materials for the job to deliver important results. And some examples in science can illustrate this, like the Masterson-Stowe experiment in biology carries this name of the most beautiful experiment in biology. And we can see why that is the case. That experiment was so well designed for purpose. It delivered incredibly important results. It had very significant and clear results, decisively decided between three hypotheses that were entertained at the time after the question was basically posited as to how DNA replicates. And that experiment was really well designed for purpose, using innovative materials for the time, illustrating the creativity, ingenuity of the experimenters to deliver that goal. So when we think about what was beautiful about it, it was the design and the significance, that relationship between the two, that I think we should really be focusing on when we think about the aesthetic value of it rather than anything else.
Right. And could you say a bit more about significance? Is it in terms of the experiment being capable of decisively adjudicating between rival hypotheses, or what counts as significance there?
Yes, that's a great question, because the two examples we discussed so far do something very important and quite straightforward to understand, right? The pendulum experiment wanted to demonstrate something, and it did. It demonstrated Earth's rotation. And the Masterson-Stowe experiment was a crucial experiment in science. It decided between three hypotheses. I mean, that's great, right? And other experiments we can think detected particles like the LHC few years ago detecting the Higgs boson. That's success stories in science, when we have demonstration of effects that we want, we have hypothesized over, but we have not demonstrated, or we have the confirmation of a theory or hypothesis, or we have the discovery of a particle or a phenomenon generally. That's great, but I think we need to have a much more broad notion of significance, because sometimes even now results can be very significant, and we wouldn't want to say that an experiment that did not achieve discovery for good reasons is not beautiful. So I was motivated to think about this by thinking about the ether experiment and the fact that, well, there was no detection there, but for good reason. And that experiment was well set for purpose. And in the sense, I take that experiment to show us something important about what we consider significant result, and the fact that sometimes obtaining no results, or just the results that do not align with expectation, actually is where the beauty gets derived from. And in a sense, that's parallel to artworks as well. Sometimes the most interesting, beautiful artwork can be the one that really challenges your accepted assumptions. That kind of experiment, of course, not every now result experiment, but it's very much contingent on many factors. Some now results also generate significant, basically, consequences by asking you to re-examine assumptions, and that can be really productive. So here is where we talk about productive surprise and disruptive, basically, results that lead to something important, enrich our knowledge, enrich our engagement with the subject. And here we can make a distinction between, the results that aligned with theoretical expectation and the ones that do not, and the fact that the latter very often can be really where the goods are by pushing us, enabling ultimately progress.
So is surprise a crucial feature then of significance?
I think so. Surprise and what I call sometimes a disruptive, like productively disruptive result as well, because surprise can imply both a happy feel and not so happy feel, but disruption is really, it can be compared to not a pleasing aesthetic experience, but still an aesthetic experience that has cognitive significance, right? So not every artwork as well will produce pleasure or pleasing surprise, right? Sometimes the disruption is quite unpleasant. Lots of artworks confront us with notions we are not necessarily very happy to engage with, but it's worth it, right? When the artwork is well done, it's a worthy engagement because it interrogates you in a productive way. And I think similarly with the experiment as well.
You're listening to Beauty at Work. Is beauty still the best term for this then? I would understand beauty in the design, an elegant design where you're trying to sort of say minimize the number of possible intervening variables, and then you have, you would say that I'm trying to design a beautiful experiment that's really elegant. Would you also consider this aspect of significance under the category of beauty, or is it a different kind of aesthetic experience, or how would you talk about that?
So I take it that the aesthetic experience can be very diverse and it can be disruptive, unpleasant, or sublime experience somewhere in the middle. But I also find that the concept of functionality in beauty can do a good job in telling us how those diverse experiences relate, because we ultimately can appreciate how the artist or the scientist delivered those responses in us and how the setup basically enabled the delivery of those responses via the result that it had. So I think thinking about beauty in that way can still be used in a productive way, but we need to appreciate that not every experience in science will have the happy feel to it. Like we usually think about beauty as a more straightforward, I guess, response that we have, that some of them are more complex and demanding responses. Yes.
Thank you. Now, some scholars have argued that beauty can be a source of bias, at least in scientific theories. Is this a concern in experimentation at all?
So it's not my concern so far, simply because I think I'm staying at a much more basic level of analysis. I'm not thinking about the big questions at this stage. I'm really wanting to understand how the aesthetic judgment entered in the construction of an experiment, the selection of the experimental setup, the evaluation of the results. I want to understand that practice, right? And I'm not asking the big questions, but I have asked them in the past, and I'm interested in this question. And I think Sabine Hossenfelder, who published this really fascinating work, Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray, I think she raises some really important questions. And I find myself in a lot of agreement with these arguments because she highlights something very important, that sometimes when you have values, they can function very well. They can be well motivated. But sometimes we don't examine those values. They might start not aligning with our goals, or maybe they can start clashing with other values that we have. So we need to interrogate and examine the values that are operating. And I think in that sense, she's asking something really important. And I wouldn't think that that question doesn't apply really well in scientific experimentation as well, right? In any field, I think you have to ask those questions. Why do I have preference for these particular features? What do they give me? And are these features aligning with these values? Are they aligning with other values that I have? And in her work, of course, she's arguing that currently the beauty ideal is not aligning with some other values that perhaps are much more important. And I think that's a really good question to ask at all times.
Yeah, I suppose with, as I'm trying to think about designing an elegant experiment, I find it hard to imagine an objection to that in the same way. Whereas, with the question of an elegant theory, or like, oh, this sort of equation is really elegant, so therefore we should invest billions of euros. That seems a bit different, right? Where Whereas, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, do you think that the sort of that aspect of elegance in experimental design could be immune to this critique, or?
I think there is something to this, right? Because at the end of the day, who wants to have an overcomplicated experimental setup that no one can replicate or that increases the chances of error? We don't want that. And we also want to have a recipe other people can follow. And we want to have a recipe that we can communicate with students. So in that sense, I think perhaps more immune in the context of experimental setup, the idea of optimality and simplicity and just, yes, elegance more generally. I think they're really important factors that are ultimately just speaking about operational simplicity and functionality being quite central ultimately to us as cognitive agents that need certain ways of operating within a setup and have some limitations. Of course, we want those features to be part of our experiments. So I think perhaps the notion of functional beauty survives that objection.
Well, let's talk a little bit about significance more personally. What has in your inquiry, I guess, how has it impacted you? Is there anything from this work that you found beautiful?
Oh, I am constantly looking at images or experimental setups that scientists are producing in different fields and feeling very inspired. And I did not expect this. When I started studying philosophy and history of science, I had 2 years of training in different sciences. And I used to think, why am I not doing science then? Why am I proceeding to do philosophy rather than, proceeding to do cognitive science or physics or mathematics? And I used to think, well, I don't want to just be learning facts. I want to know how these were derived. I want to know about the process. And that's what I found really fascinating and very kind of rewarding. Now I understand, of course, that that aspect, of course, is very much recognized by scientists themselves, and people are really happy to talk about their creativity and how, so many scientists talk to us about how they feel like cultivating their creativity and doing fine arts or whatever is really integral to them thinking about themselves as good scientists. Those have been very rewarding, pleasing experiences for me because I think my idea starting my education was very different. I used to think, well, it's just about learning facts. There's nothing about values in here. And suddenly just appreciating this aspect is really, really, I think it's beautiful because you get to learn about how science is produced, the human factor, the values and the motivations of individuals that then form communities that then make important discoveries. All of that is really, really beautiful to me. It just feels very rewarding. So yeah, that's what I like reading about instead of novels, to be honest. That gives me a lot of pleasure.
That's great. I mean, that really resonates with my experience of talking to scientists, and I mean, the same kind of discovery that you're describing, I think, in better words than I can put, is really what I find, really, pleasing, beautiful in these encounters with the scientists I've been interviewing over the last couple of years, and seeing their responses to surveys and so on. It's been really quite exciting.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, tell us, what are you hoping your readers would learn? Like from this work, you're writing now a book on beauty and experiments, and you've written quite a bit on this in your journal articles. What do you want your readers to take away? How might understanding these aesthetic dimensions of experiments be helpful for scientists and even for philosophers?
Oh, right. Yes, I think, well, if I had to think specifically about scientists, what I would like scientists to take away from this work, and it's kind of intimidating for a philosopher to think scientists engage with their work, but I do know that they do engage because they write to me and say how much they liked thinking about this. It's actually really rewarding to think that by reading, so I wrote even a few popularizing articles about this just to reach more readership. And I see that when scientists write about reading this particular work, they acknowledge that sometimes they had not thought about it, that they just pursue their work and they focus on the problems that they're solving, and they don't think so explicitly that they make aesthetic judgments or that the aesthetic sensibility matters in what they're doing, but that is actually very important to them and it actually matters. So I think, if I can help in bringing to the surface that aspect of scientific practice more, make it more visible, more studied, and that people are more aware that these are important factors, I think it will be really important for scientists to talk more about this aspect, because we do have this sometimes really unhelpful way of thinking about science as it's like an algorithmicized product of, following rules. We think about, anything like arts and humanities as less important. And we have sometimes attacks on those fields saying, well, only fund STEM research. I think this is so important to acknowledge the integration and the interaction between these fields, and that philosophical work can help identify values that at play, but also can identify what is special about science, right? This is one of the first things we do in philosophy of science, like what makes science science? What is it that is special about? How does it demarcate from other kind of activities? And we usually want to say, well, it's about this kind of strict evaluation of evidence and method, but we want to understand also that, well, science is also done by human beings and they have interests and values, and understanding those values, where they come from, why they're there, how they operate, exploring them, analyzing them, bringing them to the surface and making them more explicit, basically. We know that bias can be bad when it's implicit, but when you explicitly identify your values, then they can be examined, interrogated, and corrected for if they're actually maybe coming into friction with other values. So I think that's really important, and I hope that's something that we can have more discussions about. When it comes to philosophers, however, I hope that more people will start paying attention to aesthetics in science, because one of the reasons why I didn't do this topic as a PhD student is because I used to think, well, no one would take this seriously. It was not really a topic that was very discussed, and I felt like it was not a legitimate question to posit there. And the more I was learning, I was realizing, well, that's actually not true. That's not true. And I should have been more brave about my choices. And we can learn so much by thinking about experiments, answering those big picture questions, right? So some people in philosophy of science have argued that beauty is a concept that constantly evolves and changes and is dynamic and revolutionary. And we can understand change in science as change that is actually driven by aesthetic changes. And, well, the most obvious thing to ask now is, this work is very much grounded in theorizing and theoretical changes. What about scientific practice? When we think about the experiment, do we find such revolutions? Do we find those revolutions aligning with theoretical revolutions? And I think I've already alluded enough to the answer that perhaps not so much. And so this is something that I hope philosophers will engage more with when we start thinking about scientific practice. What do we learn about the involvement of these aesthetic judgments and how they're operating, and how they ultimately will lead us to answering the big questions in a different manner? And also just recognize the role we pay to the aesthetic sensibility in science and how we understand discovery, right? I think more attention needs to be paid now into discovery once we're moving also into very new ways of discovering, where it's not only humans that discover.
Right. And finally, for those of us who are not scientists or philosophers, what might be some of the implications of your work? I mean, should we be thinking about science or scientists in a different way? Should the public, from your work, revise their understanding of scientists in some way? And should we also, I mean, beyond the context of science, should we pay attention to certain aspects of beauty in our work, whatever fields we're in, that we may not be paying attention to?
So how would kind of our ideas about science change when we think about this aspect? I think perhaps not so much, and perhaps a lot. If we think about some old-fashioned ideas of how we think about science as something that follows rules, and we think of scientists as kind of, it's just about following an algorithm here. You just obtain evidence, update your hypothesis, and that's it. If we have that idea of science, then yes, we're going to learn a lot. We'll have to revise our ways of thinking. But I do think that in the last years, at least in philosophy of science, we have been recognizing more and more that science is value-laden. Of course, it is value-laden given that it's practiced by individuals, human beings that have certain cognitive capacities or certain kind of embodied experience, of course, science will have values, will impact in the questions that we ask, in the kind of answers that we have. But there are a lot of, developments in social epistemology that give us really sophisticated answers as to why science continues to be very special in light of these factors about human values. And that's to think about the arrangement of scientists, right? Scientists are arranged in groups that have self correcting mechanisms. So we can start thinking about also, if we're worried about the involvement of beauty in science, we can think about the fact that there are still self correcting mechanisms in science that can identify whether we are driven by values that perhaps are not aligning with other goals and values that we have, or whether the values are well fit for purpose. So it depends on what kind of preconception you have, how sophisticated your conception about science and how it works is. But if one thinks, well, it's all about rule following and there's no place for personal judgment, well, definitely looking into the aesthetics of science, we're going to see that that's definitely not the case. There is a lot of judgment. And scientists recognize this. Like when we have great mathematicians and physicists talking about their discoveries and often are recognizing the personal factors, they're emphasizing what was the problematization around the time that they had. Sometimes it has to do with their own life and their own jobs, and the fact that they had this aesthetic sensibility, well-trained aesthetic intuition, they would say, that made them select particular ways of thinking and led them to the discovery. So that's really important, and how we can enrich perhaps our activities by thinking about beauty and science. I think there is something to be said about the fact that beauty enables and facilitates effective communication of ideas, right? Out of practicality, I think it's nice when you have neat ideas, neat writing, or very elegant ways to present slides, shows, and using visuals. I find that as an educator, I pay a lot of attention to have very lovely looking slides and showing my students beautiful images of instruments or scientific images. There is something to be said about how much that affects one's ability to process information. No one wants to look at messiness. It takes longer to analyze complex, not well written, and not well presented information. And there's, of course, evidence for this from cognitive psychology, right? This study into fluency processing and disfluency processing, and how beauty is this experience of when things fit into pre-established frameworks. It's just faster processing on our behalf. We'll understand this faster if it has these kind of features we perceive as beautiful. So I think there's something to be said about trying to communicate ideas in an elegant manner. It's just practically easier for people to follow us, I think.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's really crucial for us to think about elegance in the various kinds of things we're designing and communicating in the world, right? What is it that we're trying to do, and how might we do that more elegantly so that we could, I think, be more effective in whatever we're trying to do, it would seem. And and with scientists, I mean, I think one of the things that I've been wondering about is whether this work that's being done, that you're doing, that my team and I are doing, whether that could help in some way to improve public trust in scientists. And a lot of the research suggests that the mistrust of scientists comes not from a mistrust of science per se, but sort of a skepticism about the morality of scientists. There's something about, at least in the United States, the research suggests that there's some kind of skepticism that scientists are not trustworthy. And you'd said earlier that beauty is a feature of trustworthiness. And I wonder, if there's something there that we could harness, if there were some way perhaps for the public to, better access the aesthetic experiences of scientists, to share in those experiences. I wonder if that might help. I don't know what that would take. I suppose in a way, maybe people like Boyle were kind of trying to do that back in the day, 350 years ago. But, Hobbes was very skeptical. And I think a lot of scientists today are skeptical that would people who even observe the same experiment interpret it in the same way, even if they're seeing the same things? Wouldn't their political priors or their agendas or confirmation bias affect things? But I wonder whether it's not so much the results, the beauty of the results, but the beauty of, say, the design, or appreciating some other aesthetic aspects of what scientists do, even developing a taste for the same values, a taste for the aesthetic of discovery or insight or understanding. Would that have any traction, do you think, in improving public trust in science?
That's a really interesting question, and I continuously think about it. And yes, in light of the sad times that we're living in, when there's so much misinformation and mistrust towards science and scientific results, you cannot avoid not noticing it and feeling really disappointed that at the end of the day there isn't as effective communication between scientific community and public for whatever reason. And often it's not the scientists to be blamed for this, of course, but what can we do to do the job better? If we see beauty as just another value in the family of many values that drive scientists in pursuits and in ways that they justify their ideas, you can be skeptical. That's absolutely fine. But there are other ways to justify still what makes science very special. And that is the self correcting mechanisms I was talking about. Like scientists do correct their ideas, they are responsive to evidence, they don't hide away from evidence. Right? No one's going to trust you if you continuously discard someone's research that doesn't speak in favor of your ideas. There's a public aspect to science. There is the communal aspect to science. There's so many different features of the organization. Like one of my favorite philosophers, Helen Longino, has talked about this a lot. The kind of structures in the community that are self-correcting, that ultimately facilitate for critical evaluation of where scientists are going and how well we basically they're achieving goals. Ultimately, recognizing that even if you attack the idea that scientists are objective individually as an individual agent, you can have objectivity of communities because of these self-regulating mechanisms that are definitely not features of pseudoscientific activities, for instance. So that's one way to think about it, that it doesn't have to undermine the integrity of science to acknowledge the personal factors that are operating. Okay, so maybe sometimes beauty is really well justified as a pursuit in scientific theories, and sometimes it can lead to stagnation, as Sabine Hossenfelder argues. But one of the things that she's doing is prompting discourse and opening a debate. And now everyone is debating it and it's taken seriously. That objection is taken seriously, and that's important to acknowledge, right? So if we perceive that these are subjective factors, which I think we can question that, right? We said enough today, I think, to make us think that there are some kind of well-established ways to think about beauty that are agreed upon. But even if we take it that, oh, well, people can disagree about what's beautiful and whether this should affect pursuits or not, we can still appreciate that we can debate this, right? We can analyze it, identify if it's operating in a way that is maybe coming into friction with other ideas that we have and other values that we have. So in that sense, I feel like I hope people understanding those facts about science are really important. And subjectivity of individuals doesn't have to mean we don't trust scientists, right? There is other features we can focus on to understand why science is special in delivering knowledge about the world and understanding, and definitely where we want to go following public policy and things like that. But, can we improve scientific understanding by thinking about the aesthetics of science? I think certainly it helps a lot thinking about, these very interesting features about scientists, that they are, at the end of the day, like everyone else, wanting to find out how the world works, and they want to find out how to cure a disease or how to deliver products that help humanity advance. And everyone is interested in how this ability works, right? How is it that some people are just so good at this stuff, coming up with these new ideas? What did they do? What was so special about them? And there's so much recent discussion about the role of the creativity and the imagination as scientific discovery. And it's really fascinating now that we are thinking more and more about the future of science and what discovery looks like today, to see how we're turning suddenly and valuing more the human creator, the human discoverer, now that we're seeing how there is negative associations the public has with AI generated art and scientific discoveries and results. Suddenly, more than ever, we pay attention to the creator of the discovery for their ability to have aesthetic sensibility and ability to kind of feel their way through the motivation and the selection of the optimal kind of experimental design. We don't understand how AI makes discoveries, but it does, but we don't feel like it's all there by just getting an answer. We want to know how this happened. And so this, I think it's opening really productive now dimension to explore human creativity, the role of the aesthetic sensibility in our discoveries, and to analyze the future of discovery. More and more, we're going to have automation in our discoveries. So we want to understand further what's special about the human discoverer. Are we overcoming some limitations by automating? Or is it integral ultimately to achieving understanding that we have a human agent and navigating the discovery process? I think these are hopefully questions that are going to fascinate more the public, and perhaps by seeing these kind of negative reactions so far from the studies that I've seen, maybe more and more the human scientist will become valued for those kind of aspects that are perceived sometimes in a negative light due to being considered to be subjective.
Right. Brilliant. Milena Ivanova, thank you so much for joining us. And we'll provide some links to your work and other references in our show notes so our listeners can follow up on all this. So thanks so much again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out the show notes for more resources from our guest. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If you like the show, please be sure to share this episode with your friends. And also, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out. Music for this show was provided by Venkat Subramaniam, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. This season of Beauty at Work is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. To learn more about this project, please visit wellbeinginscience.com. Also, for the broader project on Beauty at Work, please visit beautyatwork.net.